When I rent an apartment, I try to stay out of other people's business. Neighbors have always been like shadows to me. Someone flickers by in the hallway, we exchange a nod, and that's it. But this time, I learned just how dangerous it can be to simply observe someone else's life. I moved into this apartment about 6 months ago. The neighborhood was quiet, and the apartment was in a prime location, top floor, windows overlooking an empty lot, no busy roads or noisy clubs nearby. The only thing that unsettled me was the building across the street. It was a typical Soviet-style apartment block, but half of the windows were dark. It seemed like almost no one lived there, and those who did behaved strangely. There was complete silence on the landings, and I rarely saw kids or groups hanging out in the yard. Not that I cared much. One of the few alive windows in the building across the street faced directly opposite my kitchen. In the evenings, I occasionally noticed a light in that window. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I started noticing a man sitting there looking outside. It became a nightly occurrence. He didn't look strange or scary, just an ordinary man, probably around 45 or so. He had sharp features and short cropped hair. Sometimes he smoked. Other times, he just stared into the void. One evening, when I stepped out onto my balcony, I decided to wave at him. I don't know why, I just felt like it. The man looked directly at me but didn't respond. He didn't wave back, didn't avert his gaze, he just kept looking. It was a bit awkward, but I forgot about it soon enough. A couple of weeks later, I noticed him more frequently. He wasn't just at the window anymore, he'd started sitting out on his balcony too. One evening, I realized that his gaze was deliberately tracking me when I went out onto my balcony. If I stayed out for a bit, he'd stare at me intently. To be honest, it started to irritate me. I began noticing little things. When I'd turn off the kitchen lights in the evening and step out for a smoke, I'd feel like he was sitting there in the dark, watching. Sometimes I'd turn the lights back on and deliberately look his way. He'd either pretend to be busy with something else or just disappear from view. Then it escalated. One night, I heard the faint buzz of a messenger notification. It wasn't my phone, it sounded like vibrations through the walls. A minute later, I received a message from an unknown number. "Why are you up so late?" That caught me off guard, but I figured someone must have sent it by mistake and ignored it. A few days later, it happened again. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea when another message arrived. "What are you drinking tea with?" I froze, staring at my phone. It was nighttime. The apartment was dark and I was sitting right by the window. I stepped out onto the balcony and looked sharply toward his apartment. As always, the man was there, but this time he didn't look away. His face seemed almost like he was smiling. I replied, "Who is this?" No answer. It started weighing on me heavily. At work, I'd catch myself thinking about him, how he stared, how he messaged me. In the evenings, I tried not to go near the window, but curiosity always got the better of me. Sometimes I felt like I could sense his gaze even through the closed curtains. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to trace where the messages were coming from. The messaging app allowed me to determine the approximate location of the sender. I opened the settings and yes, it was the building across the street. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe he somehow saw my number, accidentally, spied on me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch thinking about what to do. Ideas ranged from simply moving to another apartment to confronting him directly. The next morning, things got worse. When I woke up and checked my phone, there was a new message. "Why are you thinking about me?" I replied. "Who are you? What do you want?" After a few minutes, a response came. "We're neighbors. I'm just making sure everything is fine." I laughed nervously. Fine. What kind of absurdity was this? I tried looking him up on social media, scouring for any information, but found nothing. That evening, I decided to go to his building, just to check. When I got there, I noticed that the entrance was dilapidated. The glass on the door was shattered, and the staircase inside was littered with dust and debris. But I went up to his floor and found his door. There was no number on it, but I could smell cigarette smoke wafting from underneath. He was definitely there. I knocked. No one answered. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. "Don't come inside. Just go back home." That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the kitchen. I needed to figure out who this man was and why he was doing this. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, the message read, "Neighbor, you know I can see you, right?" Panic set in. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains. He was standing by his window, staring at me as if reveling in my fear. I rushed outside and called the police. When they arrived and entered his apartment, they found nothing. The room was empty. The only thing left was a pile of cigarette butts on the balcony. Now I live in a different apartment, but sometimes I still feel like someone is watching me from the shadows. When I tell this story, people often think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. This happened to me, and even years later, I remember every detail as if it were yesterday. I worked at a small digital marketing company. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid enough to cover my rent and order takeout. The only downside was staying late at the office. Sometimes I was the last to leave. One Thursday, my coworkers left earlier than usual. We had a deadline, and I needed to finish a report. By the time I was done, it was past midnight. I closed my laptop, stretched, and stepped into the dark office corridor. The building was completely silent. Not a sound. It was a typical office center, but at night it felt almost abandoned. The ceiling lights flickered on with a delay as I walked toward the exit. That flickering always annoyed me. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button to call it. The air inside the building felt heavy, as if the walls were soaked in stale air. The elevator arrived and its doors opened with a dull creak. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor, and the cab began its descent. Halfway down, the elevator suddenly stopped. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but when the light in the cab went out, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. I stood in total darkness, feeling only the faint vibration of the cab. Panic set in. I started pressing buttons, but nothing happened. My phone was in my pocket, and I quickly pulled it out. The screen lit up the cab, but there was no signal. I tried calling the building's support line, but the call wouldn't go through. 5 minutes passed. I stood there trying to stay calm. Then I thought I heard a faint noise, a soft rustling like someone running their hand along the metal wall of the elevator. I quickly turned, shining my phone's light at the wall. Nothing. It's just nerves, I told myself. But the sound came again. This time, it was closer. I remembered the elevators in this building were old and told myself it was probably just the cables. But my heart was racing. Suddenly, the elevator jolted and the light came back on. The cab resumed its descent as if nothing had happened. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the empty first-floor lobby. Outside, I took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to shake off the incident. At home, I tried to distract myself, put on a show, ate something from the fridge, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I kept feeling like I'd forgotten something. When I went to bed, I was haunted by a strange dream. I saw the same elevator, but its walls were smeared with something dark. In the corner of the cab stood a figure resembling a person, but their face was hidden in shadow. I woke up in a cold sweat. The clock read 4:18. Now I picked up my phone to check messages and noticed something strange. A new recording had appeared in the voice recorder app. I hadn't made it. At first, I thought I must have accidentally hit record when I used the flashlight in the elevator, but the file was over 3 minutes long. I hit play. The first thing I heard was the usual ambient noise, probably the sound of the elevator machinery. But then faint footsteps began. They sounded as if someone was pacing inside the cab while I was there. This can't be real, I thought. On the recording, I could clearly hear myself breathing heavily as I tried to figure out what was going on. But the most terrifying part came at the end. A barely audible whisper said my name. Alex. The recording stopped. I couldn't believe my ears. I played it again and again, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just noise from the elevator or a glitch in the recording. But why did it say my name? The next day, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. It sounded too ridiculous. Work went on as usual, but by evening, I was alone in the office again. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. As I was getting ready to leave, a coworker from a neighboring department approached me and asked, "Were you in the office last night?" I said yes and asked why she was asking. She hesitated before replying. "It's just, I thought I heard someone walking in the corridor when I was leaving. I thought it might have been you. That unsettled me. I'd been alone in the office that night." A couple of days later, I decided to analyze the recording. I didn't know much about audio files, but I found a program online that let me isolate frequencies and sounds. When I loaded the file, everything seemed normal until I zoomed in on the whisper. It wasn't just random noise. The frequency perfectly matched a human voice. I felt my fear turn into paranoia. A week passed. I tried to forget about it, but the anxiety lingered. Every time I stepped into an elevator, my breathing quickened and my hands turned cold. One night, I stayed late again. This time I took the stairs. Outside, I glanced back at the building. A light was on in the office, even though I was certain I'd turned it off. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried home. That night, I had another dream. I stood in a dark corridor, hearing a faint whisper behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but the feeling of someone being close was so real I could feel warm breath on my neck. When I woke up, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told my boss I wanted to work from home. Years have passed since then. I changed apartments and jobs, but sometimes in complete silence I still hear footsteps or a whisper saying my name. I've always considered myself a person with strong nerves. Working in delivery, I've grown used to night shifts, sketchy neighborhoods, and unfriendly customers. If someone had told me this story, I would have probably laughed and brushed it off as a figment of their imagination. But now I realize the line between reality and fear can be shockingly thin. This happened about 6 months ago. I had picked up an extra shift to earn some extra cash. The night seemed calm, just a quiet Friday in the city. No holidays, no major events. Orders were sparse, and it felt like I was just aimlessly driving through empty streets. Around 11 p.m., I got an order from a small pizzeria. The address: an old residential area on the outskirts of town. I was familiar with the neighborhood. It was full of old wooden houses, half of which were abandoned. The streets were poorly lit, and the pavement looked like it had been through a war. I'd delivered to that area before, and it usually involved odd encounters. Sometimes the customers weren't home. Other times they came out in strange robes, as if expecting someone else. But those were minor things I'd gotten used to. I arrived at the address. The house looked dilapidated with a crooked fence and dark windows. Another order for some recluse, I thought. My phone vibrated, showing the client's number. I called, glancing around as I waited. No answer. I tried again, but still no response. Sighing, I got out of the car, approached the gate. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. Maybe it's another address mix-up, I thought, but decided to check anyway. Leaving without attempting delivery wasn't in the rules, and I didn't want to miss out on the tip. As I got closer, I noticed the gate was slightly ajar. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling like movement from inside the house. I knocked on the door. "Pizza delivery," I called out loudly. There was no response. I tried the door, but it was locked. Then, barely audible, as if muffled by the walls, I heard a voice. A woman's voice speaking in a strange, almost sing-song tone. My nerves tightened, but I decided to wait a few more minutes. Then I heard something else, quick footsteps, as if someone descended the stairs and stopped near the door. My heart pounded. I was about to knock again when the door abruptly swung open. Standing there was a middle-aged woman in a gray robe. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes looked tired or frightened. "Pizza, right?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "Yes." "You didn't answer, so I thought maybe I had the wrong address." She glanced over her shoulder as if checking for something behind her, then quickly took the box. "Thanks. Here's the money." She shoved some bills into my hand and slammed the door shut. I stood there for a moment trying to process the odd encounter. Customers were usually either friendly or irritated, but this woman seemed like she'd been caught off guard. When I got back to my car, I noticed she'd overpaid a lot. The money she'd given me was about 3 times the cost of the order. I tried calling her again, but once more, there was no answer. On my next delivery, I tried to brush off the encounter, but something about it stuck with me. Later that night, after my shift ended, I decided to drive past the house again just to make sure everything was okay. The house looked the same. Dark windows, no signs of life. The gate was closed. A sense of unease crept over me. The next day, I mentioned the incident to my coworkers. They just laughed it off. One of them joked that weird things always happened in that area. But later, I learned something that made me see that night in a whole new light. Over the weekend, I ran into an acquaintance who used to live in that neighborhood. When I mentioned the address, his expression changed. "You delivered there?" he asked. "Yeah." "Why?" He hesitated. "That house. No one's lived there for years. There was a fire a couple of years ago. The husband died, and his wife disappeared. They searched for her but never found her." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Not funny. I was there 2 days ago. delivered a pizza to a woman. He gave me a look like I just said something insane. "You must have gotten the address wrong. Nobody lives there." But I hadn't gotten it wrong. The next day, driven by curiosity, I went back to the house. This time, I parked farther away and walked up. The gate was shut, and it looked like no one had been there in ages. The yard was overgrown, and a rusty padlock hung on the front door. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. Then, a man from a neighboring house, a grumpy-looking old man, noticed me. "What do you want here?" he called out. I walked over and explained about the delivery. The man frowned. "Don't know what you're talking about. That place has been empty for years." I left feeling uneasy. Had I made a mistake? Or had the woman really been living there illegally? This story might have remained a strange mystery in my mind if not for one final twist. A few days later, I stumbled upon a news article. In that same area, police had discovered a woman hiding in one of the abandoned houses. She had apparently been on the run for years. Among her belongings, they found a pizza box, the same box with my company's logo. Since then, I've stopped working night shifts.